So, continuing on, what does evolution tell us? And kind of more importantly, what does evolution not actually tell us? So, one of the big things I like to make sure my students understand is that evolution does not explain how life first started. That's a completely different branch of biology. Well, obviously not too different, but it's different enough for these purposes that evolution doesn't tackle that question. What evolution does is it explains that once life started, it shows how it diversified into increasingly complex and increasingly different forms of life that allowed it to spread all over the planet. And we see evidence for that today, and we see the evidence for that in the fossil record and other forms of evidence that we'll cover a little bit later. But evolution also tells us life shares a common ancestor. So all things that are alive, if you go back far enough, we actually share a lot of ancestors together. And back even further, we all share a common ancestor. And that idea is called common descent, the idea that we descended from a common ancestor. And we see evidence for that in the fossil record. Especially, we see evidence of that within our DNA and within many other traits that we have. And that's kind of important. And one of the second things we'll talk about as a continuation of the evolution unit is phylogenetic trees, which you can see here. It's kind of a cartoony one, but it's the idea of this branching and splitting based on shared characteristics that we can use that kind of shows the evolutionary relationship and evolutionary history. Not a literal timeline, but definitely shows the passage of time and how we are structured and how we are closely related to certain organisms and a little bit more distant from other organisms. So evolution is kind of a very useful tool because the more we understand who we're related to and who we're not and how we're related, we can better understand ourselves and we can better understand the world around us and how it works and operates. And that's a good thing. So let's talk about fitness. Now, fitness, as you can see up here, this is a little interesting, but fitness is not just being strong. It's not like CrossFit. When we talk about environmental fitness, we're not necessarily talking about being strong. We're talking about having traits that allow you to survive in a particular environment. So my question I always ask my classes is, which one of these guys do you think is more fit? The big muscly guy or the guy with the muscles drawn on? And everybody's like, oh, well, the big muscly guy, he's way more fit. I'm like, well, really? The scrawny guy's kind of getting the girl. So maybe in this circumstances, being charming and funny and witty is way more of a environmental fitness than being the big muscly guy. So it always changes. And depending, because we know the environment's always changed, we know that environmental fitness can change as well, because you never know, in 1 minute, being big and bad and bulky and strong could be a great environmental fitness for the circumstances you're facing. But then maybe you got to squeeze through a tight hole to get away from a predator. Well, the smaller, scrawnier guy is going to fit through that. The bigger guy will not. So in that instance, being the smaller one's a little bit more environmental fit. So what I like to stress is that the way evolutions work is it doesn't create something from nothing. It takes a pre-existing structure and just modifies it. Because remember, all this is done with genes and the passing on of genes between generations. Natural mutations occur, just random changes in the base code. And also through sexual reproduction, we have crossing over, we have recombination, we have independent assortment. All of this leads to slight differences in the DNA. And remember, the DNA is a blueprint, right? So if I have a blueprint right here for a living thing, I've got another blueprint right here for a living thing, and both blueprints are pretty much the same. That means when the organisms are created, that they will be pretty much the same. So if the DNA of one organism is very similar to the DNA of another organism, it stands to reason that they probably came from pretty recently came from shared a common ancestor. But the idea is that evolution modifies pre-existing structures. You're not going to wake up one day and have dragon scales and breathe fire. Not going to happen. But what you will do is have an offspring that maybe has slightly longer legs or slightly longer arms or slightly shorter legs or maybe slightly different hair color. Because evolution modifies pre-existing DNA, which modifies us a little bit. So let's say we had a cheetah. And cheetahs are really, really fast. We all know that, right? And one of the reasons is that they actually have pretty long legs for a cat. And that helps them get better strides and move a little faster when they're chasing their prey. Well, what if evolution came through and said, okay, here's the DNA of a cheetah. We're going to modify certain parts of it and see what happens. And maybe some of those babies were born with average size legs. Maybe some had a little bit shorter legs. Maybe some had a little bit longer legs. You'd probably think, well, the shorter ones, well, they won't be able to run as fast, not going to pick off their prey as easily. And the longer leg ones, well, they'll be able to run a lot faster. But also, when it modified the pre-existing structure, it just took the amount of bone that was there and stretched it out. It didn't add any more bone. So what you end up with is a leg that's longer, but it's also more brittle. So in that case, having the longer legs, yes, you may catch your prey, but you also may be much more likely to injure yourself. And if you're a cheetah and you break a leg, that's it. You're gonna die. So in some cases, there can be limits to what evolution is capable of doing in short jumps. And again, it's the idea that it doesn't create something from nothing. It takes a pre-existing blueprint, pre-existing DNA, pre-existing structure, and slightly modifies it and just goes, hey, maybe this will work in some way, in some environment at some point in time. And there you go. Random traits are produced. Nature comes through and selects the ones that don't work, removes them out, and promotes the one that's do. So something that's fit can be, sometimes traits that we think that are fit can actually be unfit depending on the environment that they're living in. I'll give you an example of one of those cases. So over in England, this is kind of a very famous example. You may have heard this one before. There's a type of moth called the peppered moth. Right? And here's an example of it. And you can see that it lives on trees, and it especially lives on trees that have a lichen or a type of moss on it. And it camouflages in, and birds can't really see the peppered moths on there, so they're pretty well camouflaged. But every once in a while, there's a dark variation for the peppered moths. There's a dark variation for the peppered moths. And as you can see here on the picture, the birds can see these dark variations a lot better than they can the peppered variation. So the dark variation gets picked off. Well, in the 1800s around London, there's a big thing called the Industrial Revolution. And if you ever remember like the times of like Sweeney Todd and Jack the Ripper, London's kind of portrayed as being very foggy, and the buildings are pretty dark. That's because during the Industrial Revolution, there were no EPA guidelines. These factories built chimney stacks, and it dumped soot and ash all over the city, turning it jet black. So the moths living in the city and the moths living on the south side of town, all their environments were changed. Inside the city, everything turned jet black. South of town, the air quality got really bad, and it killed the lichen on the trees. So south of town, you have the same species, peppered moth, but in this case, there's no lichen, so the lighter variation actually has the greater contrast, so birds see those easier and pick them off. So what do we see more of south of town? The dark variation. What do we see more in town? Well, the buildings were pretty much jet black and darker colored, so same thing. The lighter variations were picked off, and the dark variations were selected for. So here you can see the peppered variation and the dark variation, and obviously that peppered variation is going to get picked off a lot more than the dark will. So that's an example of where in one circumstance a trait that is fit can become unfit when the environment changes. Now to continue on with that, let's say over time that these become two separate populations. Here's a population here north of town and a population south of town. As long as they don't interbreed with each other and pass the genes around to where they're all kind of genetically the same, if they keep separate from each other, over time we can see a process called speciation occur, where maybe they become so genetically different from each other that they're actually going to be considered two separate species. And that's all the start of how all the diversity of life was created, because we all don't live in the same area. We spread out some, and because the different areas, different environments, different selective pressures, therefore differences in our physical characteristics, and that's our DNA, right? Differences in our DNA. And eventually, DNA becomes so different that we can't reproduce, well, then we're two different species.